Hello, and welcome to Critical Based Theory, Episode 4. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at the authoritarianism of social groups. But first, I would like to offer some clarification on the concept of reification, which we discussed last week, because some viewers found some aspects of the episode to be unclear. If what you're looking for is a simple, clear-cut definition of reification, then it is best to understand it as a descriptive term for the process of ideas, ideologies, and ideological systems assuming a concrete form. I didn't refer to it in this way because it's not entirely consistent with Lukács's admittedly vague description of it, but it is an accurate description, I would argue, of Adorno's theory, which is essentially the same as the one we're going to be making use of today and in future. But to hammer home what this concept of reification is, I thought it would help to return to Jean Baudrillard to help understand how an idea becomes concrete so as to acquire causality over human behaviour. So the following diagram is an adaptation of something that Baudrillard calls the three orders of simulacra, which, as you will see, I have adapted to four for our purposes. Ideas, of course, begin as intuitions. Stage 1 is simply where an idea remains an intuition. We have intuitions all the time, and many of them we never even use. Now, stage 2 is where the idea is expressed through an objective theoretical framework. The idea gains an objective form after, it is introduced as an idea. And stage 3 is where this theoretical framework is instantiated as a rational process to the ends of the subject. And stage 4 is where the rational process becomes independent of the subject, to the point where it has attained some causal power over its agency. The subject then is reduced to serving a contingent function for that rational process. In between stages 3 and 4, you can see the text cited looming passivity. This is where reification occurs, where the power dynamic between the subject and the rational process shifts in the latter's favour, leading to the subject becoming a passive receptor. So the rational process shifts from being an extension of the subject's agency to something which constrains it, by reducing the subject to serving a contingent function within a process which it created. Now, you may think that this sounds very much like the outcome of the relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. Well, actually, this is a pretty useful way of thinking about it for future reference. However, let us now consider a more up-to-date example of spell checkers. Someone, of course, intuited the idea that being able to spell correctly at all times is desirable. And someone with the specific idea somebody would have a specific idea of how it should be done, would embed it in a theoretical framework to allow it to work. And the person who did this would then seek to develop a device to apply it. So on completion of the device, spell checkers in theory should help us to become improved forms of ourselves, in enabling us to amend minor errors that we can't always spot on our own, so that's what we can then focus more on developing our writing in other areas. However, spell checkers make spelling unnecessary to do from memory. It means that rather than improving ourselves, what we've actually done is outsource the duty of spelling to an external form of intelligence, and thus subject ourselves to a form of cognitive and social regression. If you recall our diagram, in between stage 3 and 4, a looming passivity seeps in. And this is where the relationship between us and the technology evolves away from technology being an extension of ourselves and towards us serving as an extension of the technology. So in working towards the goal of being able to spell correctly, we've devolved into being mere agents for correct spelling, to the cost of the communication skills we once had. As Adorno and Horkheimer argue in Dialectic of Enlightenment, the very reason that this occurs is because the relationship between ourselves and technology is not a dialogical one. Two structures of domination cannot coexist. The relationship between man and nature and man and technology is a relationship that has always consisted in one having control over the other. The third stage in our diagram, then, represents the point where we seem to somehow let go of our agency, in the reified belief that this technology serves our intrinsic interests when it rather serves to fulfill a rational principle rather than a strictly human principle. This is, of course, not to say that human principles cannot be rational principles and vice versa, but rather that what is rational is not necessarily in the social interest. This is what I'm referring to as the phenomenon of ratification, where an idea originally posited to be an extension of human interest becomes a concrete totality in itself. Anyway, let's move back to where we started in our discussion about the authoritarianism of social groups. So Adorno addresses this very problem of social authoritarianism in his essay Freudian Theory and the Pattern for Fascist Propaganda, where he attempts to use Freud's theory of mass psychology to unpack the social factors involved in how individuals transition from being autonomous and socially reflective to mere cogs in a mechanism which works towards the realization of an abstract principle. As suggested in the title, he proceeds to analyse how the Nazi establishment's propagation of anti-Semitism succeeded in getting the masses behind a homogenous political identity. One of his key observations about authoritarian ideologies and political structures is that they purposely facilitate the surrender of individual particularity by compelling individuals to identify with an idolic figure and to see themselves and their freedom through this idolic figure. The qualities of the idolic figure in authoritarian states essentially define the concrete universals of the state itself. But these concrete universals don't have to be from an idolic figure per se. They can also transcend from first principles on their own, such as the Jacobins' concept of liberté, égalité, and fraternity, or an idolic collective, as was the case with the proletariat in Marxist political theory. In any case, to Adorno, this act of identification between individual and state, or the individual and a collective ideal, allows individuals to retain the illusion of being free whilst blindly submitting to authority at the same time. The human vulnerability to such political tactics, to Adorno, lies in what Freud calls the pleasure principle, and it is this which Adorno believes to transform rational individuals into an irrational mass. To Freud, the pleasure principle is libidinal in nature. Individuals attain a sense of gratification from surrendering themselves to a mass and receiving recognition from that mass. This positive psychological sensation adheres to nothing other than conformism itself. To quote Freud directly, if the individuals in the group are combined into a unity, there must surely be something to unite them, and this bond might be precisely the thing that is characteristic of a group. With reference to Freud's framework, Adorno explains that this weakness in the face of idolatry emerges from the individual's intrinsic attachment to an authoritative father figure, which means in turn that dictators only need to successfully place themselves and their political principles as the absolute embodiment of this figure so that they can mould the masses in accordance to their political goal. In order to do this, however, an abstract force of unification must be instantiated for the people to be persuaded to act in a way that is contrary to their own rational self-interest. This can only occur if the old idols are defeated. The old idols, like the Abrahamic God, must be toppled because they stand in the way of the abstract concept of man that the dictator wants to put in the old idol's place. Once toppled, the individuals in that society, now suffering in, their lost idol's ruins, unconsciously seek a new one to step in its place, and so find themselves at the mercy of those most effective at trying to fill the void. Those who most successfully pull this off assume the role of establishing the universals of man. But in order for this new idol, to stand up, an antithesis, or rather an enemy, must be presented alongside it. This is the basis for Carl Schmitt's friends' enemies distinction in the concept of the political, which the Nazis applied. In the concept of the political, Schmitt states that politics has always been an existential matter between friends and enemies, with the be-all and end-all being related to a social group's willingness to fight and die for its existence. The interests of a group is something that cannot be outsourced or judged by a third party to Schmitt, because such parties do not have the lived experience of the group to be able to act on behalf of it. As such, it cannot be for external agents to decide what means are necessary for the protection of that identity. Only those who collapse themselves into this group identity and uncompromisingly submit to its beliefs can do so. Whether the group deems it justified to send its enemies into exile or round these enemies up with the view to exterminate them, their belief in these means is sufficient for these responses to be appropriate. The Nazi Party based its propaganda and political decisions around this friends-enemy distinction, in taking the concept of the Aryan Germanic identity to be sacrosanct and antecedent to the legal structures and institutions outside of it. Any person or group that is perceived to be an existential threat to it immediately warrants the persecution of that threatening person or group. This is a political strategy which involves the concretization of two abstract ideas. The first being the idea of a pure Germanic identity, and the second being the idea that, well, the Jews, among other groups, exist as an existential threat to the Germanic identity. Anti-Semitism, of course, far predates Nazism, but to Adorno, it gained the weight that it did under the Nazi regime because the party purposely exploited the pleasure principle. That is, the libidinal tie between individuals and the social group, which enabled the party to coerce the masses into establishing falsities as truths for the furtherance of their own political goals. To quote Adorno directly, "The narcissistic gain provided by fascist propaganda is obvious. It suggests continuously and sometimes in rather devious ways that the follower, simply through belonging to the in-group, is better, higher and purer than those who are excluded. At the same time, any kind of critique or self-awareness is resented as a narcissistic loss and elicits rage. It accounts for the violent reaction of fascists against what they deem Zerschenstand, that which debunks their own stubbornly maintained values, and it also explains the hostility of prejudiced persons against any kind of introspection." As can be witnessed today, the exploitation of the pleasure principle is not an exclusive tactic of fascism or Nazism. It is one openly used by the social justice left today, where ambiguous phrases containing thin concepts such as trans rights are human rights and no human is illegal are used for the purpose of rounding up as many people behind a cause as possible. The common phrase, "screw the system," is probably the best example of all. No content is given to the system, nor the people who are doing the screwing. It is a phrase that the agents can identify directly with because they can decide both these things and what they mean for themselves, for thus making the idea of screwing the system infinitely appealing on the grounds that any belief system can be attached to it. However, the pleasure principle is not the only thing that the social justice left is exploiting. The strategy they apply seems suspiciously alike to Carl Schmitt's concept of the political, as described earlier, which goes hand in hand, of course, with the furtherance or the role that the pleasure principle has in furthering their political goals. The biggest clue to this is that group identity is everything to these groups, as backed up by the common claim that misgendering or dead naming is equivalent to murder. We see such tactics of group identification advocated in Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance, and see the intersectionist and critical race theorists applying it in assuming themselves to have the moral basis to ostracize any dissenting view, person or group that they perceive to be an existential threat to them. Such claims to oppression come from the same narcissistic place that Adorno alludes to in his description of fascism, where the desire to identify with a group somehow eclipses the inner convictions of the individual, leading to those individuals being vulnerable to committing atrocities that they may not otherwise have done. Jordan Peterson has been heard making this exact same point about social groups demanding the coercion of gender pronouns by legal force, and perpetuating the narrative that the West is a racist, misogynistic, patriarchal tyranny. He rightly claims that those who participate in such protests or movements are likely to be reflective and reasonable when addressed as individuals, but as members of a group acting on presupposed principles in the presence of others seeking the same recognition, well, they can descend into dehumanized instruments of tyranny in a heartbeat. Now, it may appear that the intersectionists do not rely on the image of an idolic figure for a positive vision for their ideology, but they still very much fall into the idolic tradition that concerns Adorno. In fact, their concept of politics is exactly the same as Schmitt's, with the only difference being, of course, that instead of the pure German and the Jews comprising the friend-enemy distinction, the intersectionalists base theirs entirely on what they perceive to be the enemy, the immovable hegemon of the cis-het white man, with all minorities supposedly on the receiving end, becoming, by deduction, something of an idolic proletariat. As you can see from these excerpts, the Nazis justified the Jews' subjugation on the grounds that they saw them as an essentially degenerate race responsible for centuries of historical oppression who, well, even with good intentions, can only do damage to everything outside. Needless to say, this is awful stuff, of course, but the intersectionists seem to present their chosen hegemony in a remarkably similar way, And when Robin DiAngelo says things such as, well, whites hold the social and institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into the laws, policies, practices, and norms of society in ways that people of colour don't, you could make the same case that she is making the same essentialist claim about white people as the Nazis did with the Jews, namely that the only way that white people can be improved is if they subjugate their whiteness. You wouldn't be wrong to think that implicit in this idea, in keeping with Carl Schmitt, is a final solution. And whilst granted it may not yet have reached the level of mass genocide, it is very much in political swing, as was seen with Evergreen College's Day of Absence in 2017, when the college prohibited its white students from attending so that all the other minorities could enjoy the freedom created by them not being around. If Adorno was still alive, he would be considerably disturbed by the wokeness of today. Not only because he was on the receiving end of it, in the form of the German student liberation movement near the end of his career, but also because he lived to see exactly where these emergencies can lead should these people gain true political power. The group dynamics that we are seeing with wokeness is almost identical to the anti-Semitism of the 1930s and 40s, whereby individuals are subscribing to ideas that they know not to be true and committing actions that they know to be wrong as a consequence of socially coercive forces outside. Many of those who, for example, constantly exhibit views such as sex doesn't exist, and their view that one can self-identify as any race they like and change their minds about it on the following day, are more than likely gaslighting themselves for the sake of not going against the grain, or at least what they perceive to be the grain. In truth, these people who genuinely believe these things and understand the political systems behind them are probably in a very small minority. But what this means is that those who passively and unintelligibly accept the worldview of the ideologies without a moment of reflection, the reified majority, are the greatest problem that we face. I will end here with a quote from Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject or totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist.